In this lecture, we're going to be giving a brief overview into metabolism. So that's about talking about our metabolic rate. And we're talking about anabolism, so the building up of substances within the body, so proteins, glycogens and fats, and also catabolism, the breakdown of those molecules to provide energy, or quite often to provide energy. So first of all, we'll talk about the main factors that affect metabolism and your basal metabolic rate. That is the amount of energy that you basically require to live. And we'll also then go on to summarize the main metabolic processes in the production of ATP, which is, of course, the energy source that we actually use, or the source of energy that allows us to function, to power our ion channels or power our muscles, whatever it might be. So, of course, what is metabolism? Well, metabolism refers to all the chemical reactions within the body. And as you'd expect, it's providing the energy, or the ATP, that is required to maintain our body in homeostasis and therefore allows our body to perform all of its essential functions. And it's broken down into these two key components of anabolism, so building up, and catabolism, of breaking down. And so in terms of what it's actually doing, it's really important that we break down and replace damaged cells and their components. So we're breaking those down, so that would be catabolism. And when we're building them up again, of course, that would be anabolism. So it's involved in growth and cell division. So anabolism again. So you're thinking about anything that can stimulate that anabolic process. And people may often think about anabolic steroids, such as testosterone, which stimulate growth and cell division. And of course, the ATP is also required for other things. It's required for the secretion, various secretions within our GI tract, for example, contraction of our muscles, whether that's smooth muscle within our GI tract, for example, skeletal muscle, or our heart muscle. Also required for our nervous system, for example, the generation of action potentials. Generation of those action potentials obviously requires a lot of energy for all those sodium-potassium pumps that are available. So what I want you to do now is just look at this little diagram, and you can see we take in organic molecules from our blood. So that's blood there with the interstitial fluid. That's the fluid surrounding our cells, remember. So it comes from the blood into the interstitial fluid, and then it enters into our cells. And within our cells, we've then got a nice pool of amino acids, lipids, and simple sugars, such as glucose. Now, of course, when you've just had a meal, that nutrient pool comes into our cells, and we use it as an energy source, in particular glucose, but also fatty acids as well. So we're using that nutrient pool to produce energy, to produce ATP. And if it happens, we have two main compartments, simply put, or we have lots of compartments, but we have two main places within the cell to do with energy production. One of those is the cytoplasm, so that's like the fluid component of the cell, and the other one are the mitochondria. They're the energy powerhouses. And within the cytoplasm, glucose can be broken down anaerobically, without oxygen, to produce a very small amount of ATP, in fact just 2 ATP molecules. And it goes on, it produces an end result, which can be, if you're working anaerobically, muscular exercise-wise, you might be producing lactic acid as that byproduct. But it produces a very small amount of ATP. That byproduct, not lactate, but the one before it, enters into the mitochondria, or can enter into the mitochondria, where oxygen is used. And that oxygen then further breaks down those products to produce even more energy. It produces huge amounts of energy, so another 34 molecules of ATP. So you can see that aerobic metabolism, or respiration, which produces 34 molecules of ATP, is a lot more efficient than anaerobic, which produces just the 2. But wherever that ATP comes from, it helps us to move. Smooth muscle, skeletal muscle, heart muscle, contractions, okay? The intracellular transport of ions, for example, endocytosis and exocytosis. That just means bringing things into the cell and taking things out of the cell again. But also all that metabolism that's going on is producing a lot of heat. And so about 60% of the actual energy, if you like, is released in the form of not ATP, but in the form of heat. Hence why when we increase our metabolic rate, we burn more nutrients, we produce more heat. So now we've got this nice build-up of ATP, so we've got a nice bit of ATP in our cells. We've still got some nutrients left over from our meal, for example. And so we think, right, we better store these away. So we use the ATP anabolically for maintenance and growth of our tissues, to make proteins, to make lipids such as triglycerides, to replicate our DNA and RNA, and to make our carbohydrates, in particular our glycogen, our long chains of glucose. And then in between meals, of course, we need to make more ATP. We haven't got all this energy coming in. So we break down our glycogen through catabolism to glucose and then further on to make ATP. We can break down our proteins into amino acids, which can go to the liver and be turned into glucose. And we break down our lipids, our triglycerides, breaking them down into fatty acids, which can enter the blood and be used as an energy source in other systems, in other tissues. So anabolism is building, catabolism is breaking down. So each tissue, of course, when we're integrating these systems, each tissue must be provided with the usable energy sources to perform its own specialized functions. And like I said, ATP is that general energy source that all of our systems are using, but not all of our systems can use fatty acids. I've talked about this before, how the brain, for example, can't use fatty acids as an energy source, unlike the heart and your skeletal muscle and your kidneys and other tissues which can use it. The brain has to have a ready supply of glucose to make its ATP. So if we're looking at the various functions, what are the functions of each of these tissues? So as you know, I ask you questions as we go through, and I'll just pause this for a second, and I want you to just think really simply, what are the main functions of muscle? That's really quite easy. And the liver, and the kidneys, and our nerve cells. Okay, so of course, with our muscles, it's really quite easy. We're thinking about mechanical work. We're thinking about contraction of our muscles, whether that's a smooth muscle in our GI tract, the heart muscle, or our skeletal muscle. The liver has a lot of functions. Okay, one of those is biosynthesis. It makes lots of molecules. It makes a lot of the proteins that are floating around in our blood, having very important functions. It's very important in detoxification. So any drugs that you take, for example, the liver tries to detoxify them and helps to excrete them through the body, through urine or through feces. It's also very metabolically active. It makes glucose from amino acids. It stores glucose as glycogen, and it can make triglycerides. And when it makes those triglycerides, it obviously then goes off and sends them to the adipose tissue. So it's very important metabolically. The kidneys, of course, very important in pumping of ions, whether those are sodiums and potassiums, hydrogen ions and calciums. It's pumping lots of ions, and again, that's taking lots of energy. And finally, your neurons, of course, they're generating action potentials, and action potentials is all about transfer of information. So the action potentials go down the neuron, and then that goes on to release a neurotransmitter onto the next cell, which generates more action potentials. And of course, that's very requires a lot of energy. So really, the energy production in the various tissues must meet various needs at different times. And so each tissue expresses specific enzymes enabling its specialized storage and use and generation of a variety of biomolecules. So what I want you to do, and we have talked about this before, is list the major energy storage molecules in the body and tell me what their storage location actually is. So what are the main storage molecules, and where are those molecules stored? Okay, so hopefully you said triglycerides. So of course triglycerides, which are a form of fat, they are stored in our adipose tissue primarily, but we do also have some triglycerides stored in our skeletal muscle. So our skeletal muscle can use triglycerides as an energy source when it wants to. Hopefully you also said proteins. And proteins, of course, are a good energy source. They have specialized functions, but if we're running out of carbohydrates, then we will break down those proteins and use them as an energy source. And the major location for that is, of course, our skeletal muscle. And obviously the most obvious one is, of course, glycogen. So the glycogen is lots of glucoses joined together, and we have two places that we store that. We have stored in our skeletal muscle. Okay, you have about 400 grams there, and you store about 100 grams in your liver. Remembering, of course, that the glycogen stored in your liver, when it's broken down to glucose, can enter the blood and go to the tissues that require it, for example, the brain or working muscle. Whereas the glycogen that's stored in the skeletal muscle is reserved for the skeletal muscle use. It can't be excreted out of that skeletal muscle. So it is there. Once it's in there, it's there for good. So now we'll start talking about metabolism. But first of all, we'll talk about the basal metabolic rate. So really, when we're thinking about a basal metabolic rate, and you've all heard that phrase, it's the amount of energy that the body requires to maintain itself. Basically, the minimum amount required to keep you alive. And it's largely based around your total lean mass. And of course, your total lean mass includes your muscle mass, and that is largely responsible for your basal metabolic rate. And your lean mass, if you're thinking about it, includes that muscle mass, but it's basically everything except fat. Okay, so it's your skeletal muscle, it's your bone, it's your organs, your tendons, your ligaments, the fluid, whatever it might be. It's everything except fat. That's your total lean mass. Okay, so thinking that it includes your skeletal muscle, so anything that reduces your lean mass, so for example, your skeletal muscle will reduce your basal metabolic rate, so the amount of energy that you require to live. So preserving muscle mass when you're trying to lose weight is a very important way of using more energy, because you're maintaining the muscle mass, which uses more energy. And when we're thinking about basal metabolic rate, we have to be thinking about definitions of energy. And of course, the one that is frequently used are calories or kilocalories. And the definition of that is the amount of energy required to heat 1 kilogram of water by 1 degree centigrade. So that's what a cal with a big C is, or a kcal is with a little c. If you work with kilojoules, of course, that you just times that by 4.2 to get the correct value. So if we're looking at our tissues, they all use different amounts of energy. Okay, so the daily metabolic rate, so the number of calories that, for example, the kidneys used per kilogram of kidney weight is about 440 kcals or calories. Okay, the heart uses about the same in any one day, just basal metabolic rate, just enough to live. The liver is using about 200 for all those biosynthetic and detoxification and metabolic pathways that it's roles that it's playing, and the brain uses about 240. So just based on those numbers, I just want you to have a think. How much do you think adipose tissue uses per kilogram? And how much do you think skeletal muscle uses per kilogram at rest? Okay, so it's your basal metabolic rate, so it's at rest. Okay, so your fat actually only uses about 4 calories or kcal per kilogram of body weight or fat weight. So it uses a very, very small amount of energy at rest. Whereas your skeletal muscle is using 13 calories per kilogram. Okay, so it's very important. That's why we're talking about you using more energy if you maintain that skeletal muscle mass. So you don't want to lose that skeletal muscle mass. But by the same token, if you build up lots and lots of muscle and you're not using it, it's not using a huge amount of energy. 13 calories per kilogram. It takes quite a lot of effort to build up a kilogram of skeletal muscle in weight. So what is our basal metabolic rate? So the basal metabolic rate is generally somewhere between the 1200 and 800 calorie mark. It can be as low as 700 calories in some people. So the average in male is 1,700 calories, or about 7,000 kilojoules, and in females it's about 1,400 calories, which is just under 6,000 kilojoules. But remember, that is just the amount required to live. That's what your basal metabolic rate is referring to. So when we're thinking about total energy balance, we have to think about, right, what amount of energy do we need to take in to maintain the weight that we have? So your energy intake is equal to your basal metabolic rate, which, as we've just talked about, which is here. So it's your osmotic and electrogenic pumps, so your sodium, potassium pumps, etc. Synthesis of proteins and other macromolecules, such as your glycogens and your triglycerides, and other internal mechanical work, your smooth muscle, for example. So it's your basal metabolic rate plus the amount of physical activity that you might do, plus thermogenesis. Your physical activity is just getting up, moving around, doing whatever you might be doing, just not lying in bed. That tends to make up about 30% in the average person. And then thermogenesis is just the production of heat. Okay, but it's broken down into dietary induced thermogenesis. So the amount of heat that you produce when you eat food, for example, and adaptive thermogenesis. So the adaptive thermogenesis is if you go into a cold environment, for example, and you need to heat up. So you increase your metabolic rate. You stimulate the release of thyroxine, which we've already covered. That thyroxine increases your metabolic rate and you produce more heat. So first, if we're looking at basal metabolic rate. So like we've said, there are lots of factors that will affect your basal metabolic rate. You can think about lots of them now. For example, your genetics is going to play a large role in your basal metabolic rate. For example, we all have different what are called somatotypes. It's body types, really, if we're thinking about it like that. So you might have, so you might be a mesomorph in nature. That's kind of a muscular structure to your body. You might have an ectomorph structure, which is quite thin. Or you might have an endomorph structure, which is relatively high fat levels. So a lot of that is genetically based. Of course, your gender plays a very important role because of the body fat differences. So males have a lot less fat on average than females. You can see this. The average male has about 15% fat. The average female about 25% fat. So you can, again, you're starting to see the differences in the percentages there, and that's based on your body fat differences because, of course, males have more skeletal muscle, which burns more energy than fat does. Your weight plays an important role, so this is something that you can do something about, obviously. So these are things that you can change, but obesity obviously requires more energy than if you are thin, as a general rule. The amount of energy you require, you see your basal metabolic rate decreases as you start to age. You have less skeletal muscle, for example. Diet, if you are calorie starved, so anorexia, for example, that can reduce your basal metabolic rate by 30%. You're starving yourself. The body is adapting to not require as much energy. You might have disease situations. So if you have a bacterial infection and your temperature increases to 42 degrees, that increases that basal metabolic rate by up to 50%. It's very hard to produce all that extra energy. It makes you feel very, very hot. But of course, at the same time, it's helping to stop the bacteria from replicating. Your external temperature, you might be in a cold environment, that increases your basal metabolic rate. You might shiver. For example, you might cause the release of thyroxine to increase that temperature. Remember, thyroxine increases your metabolic rate, therefore increases your heat production. And that's to do with your glands, the next one. And then, of course, exercise. If you've done a lot of exercise, that has increased your skeletal muscle, therefore it has increased your basal metabolic rate because it's using about 13 calories per kilogram of muscle weight per day. So even if it's resting, there's still it's using more energy than if it was fat. So what about our physical activity? Well, of course, the amount of physical activity actually does vary depending on how hard you work. So and a lot of that is also based around your heart rate. So roughly, when people are thinking about training, if you're working at about 60% roughly of your maximum heart rate, that will mainly burn fat. You won't burn very much carbohydrate when you're working at that fairly low intensity. Because at a low intensity, your body can effectively and efficiently use fat as the main energy source. As you start to work harder and harder and harder, the proportion of fat you use gradually gets less and less and less because it can't deliver the ATP as effectively and as efficiently as carbohydrate can generate ATP. So at low levels, you burn fat. At higher levels, you're burning more carbohydrates, so more glucose. You have sustained exercise levels, of course. So regular exercise over a lifetime is far better for you than burst exercises. So you exercise, then you stop. You exercise, then you stop. Because, of course, reduction in exercise is very common. Our Western lifestyle is leading to decreased exercise levels amongst the general population. But really, is one type of exercise better for you than the other? Is it better to be doing lots of aerobic exercise? Or is it better to be doing lots of anaerobic exercise? Well, actually, they both have benefits, and we should ideally try to incorporate both into our lifestyles. So which body burns more calories? Well, if you're looking at the aerobic side of things, that's where you're doing that cardiovascular exercise. It burns a high number of calories. Okay, when I used to race, and I used to race over 10K, take just over 30 minutes, and I would burn close on 800 calories in that time. Times that by 4, and you're on to 800. 3,300, 3,400 calories, kilojoules rather, just in a race, okay, just in a 30-minute race. So it burns a high number of calories. It also reduces your fat mass because you're using that as an energy source, and therefore leads to a higher lean body mass and therefore a higher basal metabolic rate. And likewise, if you're doing lots of anaerobic work, so weightlifting and sprinting, that builds your muscle mass, leads to higher lean body mass, therefore a higher basal metabolic rate. So really what this is telling you is to have a good, healthy lifestyle, you need to have a balance of both aerobic and anaerobic exercise. So the last one of these factors we're going to cover is thermogenesis. So you have we have dietary induced thermogenesis. So basically you get increased body temperature required during digestion. So for example, if you have a high fat meal, it raises your basal metabolic rate by about 4%, so not very much. Carbohydrates by about 6%. Proteins, a lot more significant, about 30%. And hot spicy foods can have a significant thermic effect. Just want you to think about when you have something that's way too spicy for you, you feel yourself getting hotter and hotter and hotter. And because you're getting hotter, that is clearly burning a lot more calories or a lot more ATP. Okay, so have a significant thermic effect, so raising that basal metabolic rate, or rather that requirement for energy. Then you have adaptive thermogenesis. So that's where you get increased heat production to cope with temperature changes, for example. So you go out into the cold, you're cold, you start shivering, which is muscle contractions basically, that produces heat, your thyroxine levels go up to increase your metabolic rate. But of course, the human neonates, the newborns, they lack the shiver reflex. That comes on within the first few years of life. Therefore, they need to get an increase in their temperature, they need to increase the amount of thyroxine that they produce. Okay, so that's far more significant adaptive thermogenesis due to a temperature change in neonates than it is in adults. They produce thyroxine, increases metabolic rate, and that increases the heat. But of course, we have different types of fat within our body as well. So we have, to put simply, we have brown fat and we have white fat. And so brown fat is much more common in newborns, and it has a much higher metabolic rate and therefore produces more heat. And remember, they lack the shiver reflex. So it's very important to have a type of fat that can produce more heat with that higher metabolic rate. And that brown fat tends to disappear by the age of about 20, although there's some evidence to suggest some remains in the upper chest and the neck. And of course, if you're thinking about brown fat, it's a lot more active, metabolically active, so therefore it has more mitochondria, and therefore can produce more ATP, and therefore produces more heat. It also has a greater capillary network for the delivery of more oxygen. Okay, so I'd like you to have a little look at this question. Pause your computer and have a go at the questions. Okay, question 1. Which of the following are correct regarding metabolic rate? Anabolic processes include the breakdown of glycogen to provide energy in the form of ATP. That is incorrect. That is actually a catabolic process. Anaerobic metabolism occurs in both the cytoplasm and mitochondria of cells. That is also incorrect. Anaerobic metabolism occurs only in the cytoplasm and produces lactic acid as a general rule, whereas aerobic respiration is taking place in the mitochondria, and that uses oxygen and produces a lot more ATP. Number 3, your basal metabolic rate increases as skeletal muscle mass increases. That is correct. Your basal metabolic rate is influenced by diet. That is correct. For example, starvation can decrease your basal metabolic rate by up to 30%. Anaerobic training, such as weightlifting or sprinting, increases your basal metabolic rate, whilst aerobic training does not. That's incorrect. They will both increase your basal metabolic rate. So the second part of this is we're going to be covering the main metabolic processes in the production of ATP. So we're really going to be thinking about what's happening in the cytoplasm of the cell, okay, to make our ATP, and what's happening in the mitochondria to make our ATP. And it's really only at a very basic level, because you guys don't need to know more level than greater level than this. So the cell on the right hand side, you can see a cell there, okay, and that's showing the main products. So the uptake of organic molecules into the cells to give us a nice nutrient pool, which is there, and that nutrient pool has fatty acids, we've got glucose, and we've got amino acids coming into the cell. Okay, and so if we're going through an anabolic process, the fatty acids are being converted into triglycerides. Remember where that mainly occurs? That's mainly occurring in our adipose tissue, but also in our liver. Glucose gets converted into glycogen. Of course, that again is mainly happening in the liver, but this time in the skeletal muscle. And amino acids can get converted into proteins. Proteins get made in all of our tissues. But in terms of storage, when we're storing it mainly, where it can be broken down again easily, we're thinking skeletal muscle. But proteins are getting made everywhere. Okay. But when we're thinking about producing ATP, we're thinking about the breakdown of these things. And so if it's taking place, and there are three main pathways involved. One is glycolysis. So glycolysis is all happening in the cytoplasm. Remember, that's the fluid component of the cell. And the end product of that is pyruvate. And if we're working anaerobically and really hard in our skeletal muscle, for example, you'll go on to form lactic acid or lactate. That pyruvate can then enter the mitochondria, where you have a cycle, the citric acid cycle. It's also called the Krebs cycle. Okay, and during that cycle, you produce carbon dioxide. And then various products from that enter what's called the electron transport chain, and they produce ATP, and we produce water. And we have used oxygen during these processes. So that's why this is aerobic respiration within the mitochondria, and in the cytoplasm it's anaerobic because we don't use oxygen. So the anaerobic glycolysis of glucose, so that's where we're producing pyruvate, and initially that can go on to form lactate. That only produces 2 molecules of ATP, so a very small amount of ATP. Aerobic respiration, which takes place in our mitochondria, for example, here we've got glucose, reacts with our oxygen, produces CO2 and water, will produce another 34 ATP molecules. So it's far more effective, far more efficient at producing energy if we work aerobically as opposed to anaerobically. That's also one of the reasons you can't sprint for very long. You get a huge buildup of lactic acid, and that is lactic acid. It's an acid buildup within your skeletal muscle, and that obviously is stopping things working, stopping proteins working because the pH in your cells are starting to change. So if we're thinking about glucose, which tissues in the body, I want you to think about this, which tissues in the body rely solely on anaerobic glycolysis for their energy needs? And what's the end product? Okay, so what tissues only work anaerobically? Well, red blood cells. So red blood cells only work anaerobically, and therefore the end product of this is lactic acid. That lactic acid leaves the red blood cells, enters the blood, goes to the liver, and that lactic acid is then converted back to glucose so it can be used again through gluconeogenesis we've talked about before. So remember, red blood cells, they are therefore anaerobic, they lack mitochondria, okay? And the reason for that is that their function is to actually transport oxygen around the body. And if there were mitochondria in there using the oxygen, it wouldn't be very good at delivering oxygen because it's using it. So basically, it doesn't want to use the oxygen because its function is to transport oxygen to other tissues. The other tissue is, of course, skeletal muscle during anaerobic respiration, so those sprint events, so you sprint as hard as you can for 100 meters, you're working primarily anaerobically there. You're using glucose or glycogen that's stored in your skeletal muscle, breaking it down to pyruvate and then lactic acid, and producing very small amounts of energy, which again is why you can't maintain it for very long. So I want you to look at this table, pause this in a second, but complete the following table of definitions, including the main cell types where it occurs. So I want you to be thinking, what is glycolysis? What is glycogenesis? What is glycogenolysis? And what is gluconeogenesis? So what is each of those? What's the definition of each of them, and what cells are they mainly occurring in? So press pause and then come back when you've worked it out. So, glycolysis. Glycolysis, remember, takes place in the cytoplasm, of all cells, and is the anaerobic catabolism, so breakdown, of glucose to pyruvate, and then on to lactate potentially, producing a small number of ATP molecules, so 2. Glycogenesis is the synthesis of glycogen from glucose. That occurs in skeletal muscle, where we have 400 grams stored, and liver, where we have 100 grams of glycogen stored. Glycogenolysis, as the name suggests, lysis of glycogen, breakdown of glycogen to glucose. That again, because that glycogen is only stored in skeletal muscle and liver, that's where it gets broken down. Remember, when it's broken down in the skeletal muscle, which is the M in your diagram, it is reserved for that muscle's use. Whereas in the liver, it's broken down to glucose, and that glucose enters the bloodstream and can go to the brain or working skeletal muscle or wherever it might be. Finally, gluconeogenesis, the synthesis of glucose from non-carbohydrate sources or substrates. So, for example, it's taking place in the liver, as you should know by now, and it might be using amino acids, for example, but also lactic acid from red blood cells. So both of those, we are synthesizing glucose from non-carbohydrate sources. So next we're going on to lipids. And when we're thinking about lipids, we think about lipogenesis, which is the synthesis of fatty acids and triglycerides, and lipolysis, which is the breakdown of those triglycerides. But remember, some fatty acids in our body, they can't be synthesized there. These are called our essential fatty acids. And so therefore the essential fatty acids are required from our plants that we take in our diet, and they are needed to make some of the lipids that are present in our cell membranes. So they're essential fatty acids because we can't make them. We have to take them in our diet. And many tissues can use fatty acids as a source of energy. For example, your skeletal muscle, your cardiac tissue, your liver cells. Remember, our brain cannot use fatty acids as an energy source. And triglycerides are the most abundant lipid in the body, and they provide 1.5 times the energy of glucose per carbon molecule. So in other words, they get 1.5 times the amount of ATP out per carbon that's in there compared to glucose. Okay, so they're a lot more energy efficient, if you like that. They're a good, efficient way of storing energy. They're high density, and they are longer term storage molecules. And of course, lipolysis, that is when, within adipose primarily, because that's where we have our triglycerides stored, that is where your triglycerides are broken down into 2 molecules. One of them is called glycerol, the other is called fatty acids. Okay, the fatty acids enter the blood and then onto our tissues where they can be further metabolized aerobically by mitochondria. So those are the ones that will go to the heart, for example, the skeletal muscle, our liver cells. And the other one, the glycerol, that also goes back to this goes to the liver and it's converted into glucose, which can be used. But remember, fatty acids, humans cannot use fatty acids in the brain. The brain can't use them, okay? But it can, of course, use glucose. So what's stimulating the breakdown of our lipids? Well, thinking about it, if you're going to exercise, you produce lots of adrenaline when you exercise. So what the adrenaline is doing is stimulating enzymes within the fat cells to break down your triglycerides into glycerol, which is converted to glucose, and fatty acids, which your skeletal muscle can then go on to use. Okay, so it's a very useful hormone that's being produced during a fight or flight response for glycogen breakdown, but also to break down triglycerides. So you have fatty acids, which can be used as another energy source. Finally, we go on to proteins. The body can make 140,000 different proteins, a huge array of different proteins just from quite a relatively few number of amino acids. But when consumed in excess, amino acids can be converted into glucose or fat. So for example, when you're eating lots and lots of amino acids in your diet, if there's too many to get taken into the cells and used, they get converted into glucose, and when your glucose stores are filled, they'll get converted into fat. Okay, so there's only a certain amount of amino acids that's optimal to eat. But we do break down our protein when it's required. So we do break down protein for energy if we have insufficient supplies of carbohydrate. Okay, and so if we don't have enough carbohydrate, for example, our glycogen stores have run low, then the proteins are broken down into amino acids, and that's often our skeletal muscle proteins that are broken down. So those amino acids are transported to the liver, where they're converted to glucose, and they produce about the same amount of energy as 1 molecule of carbohydrate, so about 4 calories per gram. But of course, protein catabolism, in one respect, is breaking down our muscle, which we don't want, but also it produces toxic ammonium ions. So you've all smelt, or you must have smelt ammonia at some point in your lives, and that is metabolized to another molecule, urea, in the liver, and that's what you wee out. Okay, so you wee out lots and lots of urea in your liver, and that is basically coming from protein breakdown. And of course, extensive protein catabolism or breakdown threatens homeostasis because it destroys the structural and functional components of our cells. So initially, like I said, you'll be breaking down your skeletal muscle tissue, but over time you'll start to break down other proteins within other tissues. For example, in the heart, your muscle, your liver, wherever it might be, they'll slowly be broken down. And so you're destroying the structure of those cells and you're destroying the functional capacity of those cells. Okay, so you always need enough protein in your diet, but also you don't want to starve yourself, because if you starve yourself, of course, you first of all break down your muscle, but then you're breaking down other organs as well to make glucose to supply your brain. So what I'd like you to do now, okay, is complete this table of definitions, and again, talk about the main cell type where it's occurring. Okay, so lipolysis, that is the breakdown or the catabolism of triglycerides into glycerol and fatty acids, mainly occurring in our adipose tissue. The fatty acids are used around the body as an energy source, except for the brain. The glycerol goes to the liver, where it's converted into glucose, where it can be used as an energy source. Lipogenesis is the synthesis or the anabolism of fatty acids and triglycerides. That occurs in your adipose tissue and in your liver. The liver can make your triglycerides, and it then sends them off to the adipose tissue for storage. Proteolysis, the breakdown of proteins into amino acids, okay, mainly occurs in your skeletal muscle and liver. And by breaking down proteins into amino acids, those amino acids can be sent to the liver and converted into glucose through a process called gluconeogenesis. Finally, ketogenesis is the anabolism, so the synthesis of ketones from fatty acids and some amino acids. Again, that takes place in the liver. And ketones are used during starvation. So when you starve yourself for too long, you start to form more and more ketones because your brain can use ketones as an energy source. So when you're really, really starved and you're producing lots of ketones, your brain can use about 50% ketones and about 50% glucose. So it still requires that glucose as an energy source, but it can also use these ketones. Remembering, of course, that ketones are actually keto acids, so they're very acidic. So they're not good for your body because you're making your body more acidic. And there are all kinds of implications of doing this long term. And likewise, if you're going into a ketogenic state, you also have very low levels of carbohydrate storage. So you don't really have any glycogen stores. So basically, your energy levels start to drop. There are all kinds of complications of a ketogenic diet. But really, the key points, if you're looking at this, the liver is therefore playing an essential role in regulating plasma amino acid levels, okay, because it's involved in the breakdown of some of your proteins. So when you're breaking down proteins, they're converted into amino acids, which enter your blood. And of course, your glucose levels, because it's involved in glycogenesis, making glycogen in the liver for storage, glycogen breakdown afterwards, and gluconeogenesis, so the synthesis of glucose from things like lactic acid and amino acids. Okay, and there we end.